Welcome to Brightly Storytime. I'm Miss Linda. Do you like to talk? Some people are quiet, and some people are loud. Today's story is about a girl who wants to share everything with everyone. It's called Ruby René Had So Much to Say, written by Ashley Iman and illustrated by Gladys Jose. Let's find out what Ruby has to say together. Ruby René had so much to say. Did you know that flamingos don't have teeth? I can do a cartwheel and I've almost got my tumble. How many stars are in the universe? Asking questions, stating facts, and sharing dreams, Ruby René could talk for hours. Ruby learned to talk early and to question even earlier. Her curiosity was nurtured by her favorite podcasts. Each fact was a little gift, one she couldn't wait to share with anyone who would listen, especially at school. Fact. Other facts. More facts. Today we're going to learn about the American Revolution. Mrs. Hanson settled the class and began. Ooh, ooh! Ruby's hand shot up. Did you know that Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence? Yes. Thank you, Ruby. Now, class, turn to, and Ruby, hold it in your brain. We can talk more later. But Ruby René had so much to say. Ruby turned to her neighbor and tried hard to whisper. I think the war was between the United States and England. Ruby, no talking. Ruby slumped in her chair. 20 minutes later, it was time for science. Ruby buzzed in her seat. Science was her favorite subject. Ruby, let's let someone else share. Ugh, Ruby thought. But I have so much to say. The warning bell rang for lunch. Mrs. Hanson searched for the menu on her desk, but before she could find it, Ruby jumped in. Today's lunch is mac and cheese with Little Smokies. I don't like the Little Smokies though, so I asked my mom to pack my lunch. Mrs. Hanson let out an exasperated sigh. Ruby stared at her, confused. After all, Mrs. Hanson couldn't find the menu and she was only trying to help. Sigh. Oh, she thought. She wanted me to share the side options too. You can also get sliced oranges. I need all voices off, Mrs. Hanson interrupted. But I'm not finished, Ruby tried again. Now. The tone of Mrs. Hanson's voice told Ruby that she should not try again. You can also get baby carrots and ranch. Once she got going, it seemed impossible for her to stop. By the time she got home that evening, Ruby had forgotten about the lunch menu debacle, but it seemed Mrs. Hanson hadn't. Bring! The phone rang, interrupting dinner. Ruby's mom answered. She's such a bright girl, but that Ruby René has so much to say. Ruby could hear her teacher's voice through the phone. Suddenly, Ruby wasn't so hungry anymore. She'd only wanted to share her thoughts with her friends, and now she was in trouble. Ruby paced back and forth in her room. She had to think of something. She liked Mrs. Hanson and didn't want to get in any more trouble. How did people share messages when they couldn't talk? Hand signals? Morse code? Tap, tap, tap. Knock, knock, knock. It's working already, she thought. But when she looked up, she saw her dad standing at her door. Dad, I didn't mean to, Ruby started. Dad smiled warmly and placed his hand on her shoulder. Oh, Ruby René, you have so much to say, but you have to let Mrs. Hanson get through her lessons, too. Ruby nodded and launched into her plan to use Morse code the next day. She just had to figure out how to teach the rest of her classmates. Ruby's dad chuckled and he hugged his talkative little girl. How about we try this instead? He placed a small lavender journal on the bed between them. When you have something to share, just write it down here. Ruby gazed at her new journal and smiled. She had a plan. When a thought popped into her head, she would reach for her journal. She hadn't quite figured out how she would share her thoughts with her friends, but at least she'd be quiet and out of trouble. The next day, Ruby was determined not to say a word. Mrs. Hanson drew a circle on the board and divided it into 3 equal parts. Ruby's eyes grew wide. Fractions! A fraction has a numerator and a denominator. We see fractions in real life, like in pizza and on the soccer field, even on the clock. But Ruby swallowed each and every thought. She searched in her desk for her lavender journal to capture all the fraction facts zooming through her head. She was so busy trying to stop herself from sharing that she didn't hear a single word Mrs. Hanson said. An hour into the school day, Ruby had filled 5 pages of her journal. Mrs. Hanson taught a lesson on the beginning of the American Revolution, and Ruby wrote notes about Crispus Attucks. Mrs. Hanson hadn't mentioned him, and Ruby was upset that she couldn't share his story. Sure, the journal was keeping her out of trouble, but what good was a fact if you couldn't share it? By PE, Ruby hadn't uttered a single word, and she couldn't take it anymore. She loved school because she felt like she could share as much as she learned, but now it felt so one-sided. As Coach V explained the rules of dodgeball, Ruby turned to the kid next to her. Did you know that the first game of dodgeball was played hundreds of years ago in Africa? Some people don't think kids should play it because whomp! That's quite a bump there, Ruby. What happened? Ruby looked up and saw the principal, Miss Gale, smiling at her in the nurse's office. She sighed and told her all about her dilemma. Miss Gale thought for a moment, then said, "Where in Africa?" Ruby was confused. Africa's a big place, sweetheart. Where specifically did they play the first game of dodgeball? Ruby blushed with excitement. I'm not sure, but I could find out for you. Not just me, Ruby. I think the entire school would like to hear what you have to say. I've been thinking we should share a new fact every day during the morning announcements. Do you think you could help with that? Ruby beamed. She imagined herself sitting behind a big microphone, just like her podcast heroes. You got it, Miss Gale. I'm not going to let you down. At dismissal, Ruby ran to the family's minivan. How was your day, Ruby? Her dad asked, peering at her through the rearview mirror. What do you know about dodgeball? She said, pulling out her lavender notebook. I have to prepare for my segment. The next morning, Ruby sat up tall in the principal's office, waiting for Miss Gale to pass her the intercom. Good morning, Spring Lake. My name is Ruby René, and here is your fact of the day. Dodgeball was first played more than 200 years ago by African warriors in training. That Ruby René has so much to say. What a great solution Ruby found to share her facts without causing trouble. I hope you all keep reading and loving books. Subscribe to Brightly Storytime so we can read more stories together. Bye!